the trees had no end. That was the first thing Elara noticed, her breath pluming in the air like a ghost of the warmth she'd left behind. The pines of the Blackwood stood shoulder to shoulder, a ragged army of sentinels clad in bark and needle, their ranks so dense they swallowed the afternoon light whole. The map, a crinkled, overly optimistic thing she'd bought at a gas station 40 miles back, was a liar. It showed a single, meandering road leading to the Aethelred House. It did not show the road dissolving into a rutted track, nor the track being devoured by ferns and grasping roots. She killed the engine of her old Volvo. The silence that rushed in was absolute, a physical weight pressing against the windows. No birdsong, no insect hum, not even the sigh of wind through the branches. It was the silence of a held breath. Elara was a historian, a collector of forgotten things. Her specialty was the architecture of grief, the way houses absorbed the lives lived within them. The Aethelred House was her white whale, a notorious, half-mythical estate built by a reclusive industrialist, Alastair Aethelred, in the 1920s. It was a place of tragedy, of sudden disappearances and whispered madness, sealed away by law and local superstition for over 70 years. Her grant proposal had been a work of desperate, passionate fiction, but it had worked. She had 6 weeks to document the structure before the state, its patience finally exhausted, sent in the bulldozers. Grabbing her heavy pack, she stepped out. The air was cold and smelled of damp earth and something else, something faintly metallic, like old blood. The house was still 100 yards away, visible only in slivers between the trees, a hulking silhouette of dark stone and sharper angles, a brutalist monstrosity dropped into a Gothic landscape. She started walking, the crunch of her boots obscenely loud. The trees seemed to lean in, their branches like skeletal fingers. She shook the thought away. This was just professional excitement, the thrill of the chase. This was what she lived for. The iron gate was a twisted ruin, choked by a thorny vine with flowers the color of a fresh bruise. She pushed it open, the screech of rusted metal setting her teeth on edge. The front garden was a graveyard of horticulture. Statues of gaunt, androgynous figures peered from amidst the overgrowth, their features eroded into expressions of vague, eternal hunger. And there, standing at the head of a dry fountain, was the first of them. A crow. It was massive, unnaturally so, its feathers not black, but a shimmering, iridescent oil slick of color. It stood perfectly still, one bright, intelligent eye fixed on her. It didn't flinch as she approached. It simply watched. "Hello, there," she murmured, her voice small in the immense quiet. The crow tilted its head, then let out a single, guttural caw that sounded less like a bird and more like a word, a syllable she couldn't quite grasp. It launched itself into the air, its wings beating with a sound like tearing silk, and vanished over the slate roof of the house. Elara took a deep breath and turned to face her prize. The Aethelred House was a study in wrong geometry. The windows were slits, asymmetrically placed, some tilting at slight, nausea-inducing angles. The main door was a slab of darkened oak, banded with iron, and it was ajar. Pushing it open required all her strength, the bottom scraping a crescent moon into the stone floor of the entrance hall. The air inside was frigid and stale, laden with the scent of dust and decay. But underneath it was that same coppery tang. Light filtered through grime-caked windows, illuminating a vast space. The floor was a mosaic of black and white tiles, laid out in a complex, spiraling pattern that seemed to shift if she looked at it from the corner of her eye. The walls were bare stone, and a grand staircase swept upwards into shadow. Her first task was to set up base camp. She chose a room off the main hall that might have been a study. It was less oppressive, with a large, though grimy, window. She unpacked her gear, a sturdy camp cot, a battery-powered lantern, her camera, notebooks, and a small gas stove. As she worked, the silence of the house began to breathe. It was no longer an absence of sound, but a presence. She heard faint creaks from the floors above, the skittering of what she hoped were rats, and once a low, resonant hum that seemed to come from the very walls, vibrating up through the soles of her boots. On the second day, she found the library. It was a cavernous, 2-story room, its shelves crammed with books bound in strange, fleshy-looking leather. The titles were in languages she didn't recognize, filled with angular, aggressive script. But it was the center of the room that held her captive. A large, circular table was carved from a single piece of obsidian, its surface a map of the solar system. But it was a wrong solar system. There were too many planets, their orbits intersecting in impossible, chaotic patterns. One planet, a dark, jagged sphere labeled Xylos, was positioned on a collision course with a stylized Earth. It was here she found Alastair Aethelred's journals. They were hidden in a compartment beneath the table, a stack of thick, cloth-bound volumes. That night, by the hissing light of her lantern, she began to read. The early entries were mundane, obsessive details about the house's construction, orders for strange materials, rants against the limited perceptions of his architects. But as the house took shape, the writing changed. October 12, 1923, the foundation is laid. The foreman complained of the dreams, the men speaking in tongues. Fools. They dig in soil that has never felt the sun, where the angles are not 90 degrees, but 89. They feel the pressure of the truth and their small minds buckle. I must pay them more. January 17, 1924. The humming has begun. A low C, I believe. It emanates from the foundation stone. It is the key. It tunes the house, aligns it with the correct frequencies. When the alignment is perfect, the way will be open. March 3, 1925, I have seen it. In a dream that was not a dream. A city of impossible geometry, of black stone that drinks the light, under a sky of swirling, phosphorescent colors. They are there. The listeners. They are waiting. They showed me Xylos, the dark world, the key and the lock. It draws near. Elara's skin crawled. This was more than just the ravings of a madman. It was a cosmology, a detailed, insane belief system built around the house itself. Aethelred wasn't just building a home. He was building an antenna, a receiver for something from beyond the stars. The next journal was darker. August 10, 1926. The sacrifice is necessary. The house requires a soul to anchor it to this plane. A bridge of flesh and spirit. Eleanor does not understand. She fears the change in the children. But Thomas can already hear the song. Eleanor was his wife. Thomas, his son. There were no further entries about them. Local records showed Eleanor Aethelred and her 7-year-old son, Thomas, were declared missing, presumed dead, in the winter of 1926. Their bodies were never found. Days bled into one another. Elara's world shrank to the confines of the house. The battery on her phone died, cutting her off from the world. She didn't care. She was consumed. She documented everything, the blasphemous art on the walls depicting multi-limbed beings under alien skies, the rooms with ceilings that sloped to a point, the hallway that, when measured, was a foot longer on the inside than the outside. The crows were always there. A small murder of them, always the same iridescent black. They watched her from the garden wall, from the guttering, their heads cocked in that same unnervingly intelligent way. They were her only company, and their presence was a constant, low-grade dread. One afternoon, exploring a forgotten wing on the 3rd floor, she found the nursery. It was frozen in time. A tiny, rusted crib stood in one corner. A stuffed bear, moth-eaten and missing an eye, sat slumped in a small wooden chair. On the wall was a child's drawing, rendered in faded, waxy crayon. It showed a house, the Aethelred House, with a family standing in front, a tall man, a woman, a small boy. But from the windows of the house, long, spindly black arms were reaching out, wrapping around the family. And in the sky, where the sun should be, was a black, jagged planet. Elara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. She reached out, gently touching the drawing. As her fingers made contact with the paper, a wave of vertigo hit her. For a split second, the room wasn't empty. She heard the faint, high-pitched laughter of a child, smelled the scent of talcum powder and milk, and underneath it, the cloying, metallic smell of blood. The vision vanished as quickly as it came, leaving her gasping, her hand trembling. That night, the dreams began. She was standing in the library, but it was pristine, lit by a warm, golden light. A fire crackled in the hearth. A young boy with tousled brown hair was sitting at the obsidian table, drawing. "It's almost time for the song," the boy said without looking up. His voice was thin, reedy. "Father says when the song is loudest, the door will open." "What door, Thomas?" Elara heard herself ask, though the words weren't her own. The boy looked up. His eyes were wide, fearful. "The door to the city of the listeners. They're hungry. They've been waiting so long." He held up his drawing. It was the same house, the same black planet. But this time, the spindly arms were pulling the small boy figure into the house, while the man and woman stood by, watching with empty, smiling faces. Elara woke with a start, her heart hammering against her ribs. The house was groaning around her, the resonant hum louder than ever. It was a hum, a single, sustained musical note that seemed to be coming from deep underground. She scrambled for her flashlight and ran to the window. The garden was alive with crows. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, perched on every surface, all facing the house. They were perfectly silent, perfectly still. And as she watched, their heads tilted in unison, as if listening to a conductor only they could see. The next morning, she found the door. It was in the basement, a place she had avoided. The steps were rough-hewn stone, descending into a darkness that seemed thicker, colder than anywhere else. The hum was a physical vibration here, making her teeth ache. Her flashlight beam danced over shelves of preserved things in jars, over rusted tools that looked more like surgical instruments than carpentry. And then the beam fell on a wall that shouldn't have been there. The basement was a rectangle, but this wall was curved, made of the same black, polished stone as the table in the library. Set into it was a door. It wasn't made of wood or metal, but appeared to be a single slab of the same obsidian, seamless, without knob or keyhole. Its surface was carved with the same impossible solar system, with xylos at its center. And from behind it, she could feel a faint, cold draft, carrying that now familiar metallic scent. This was it. The heart of the madness. Aethelred's door. She spent the next 2 days trying to document it, to understand it. It had no seams, no hinges. It was as if the stone itself had been convinced to become a portal. Her measurements were useless. Her tape measure would kink and twist when she tried to run it along the door's edges. Her camera produced only blurred, streaked images. The hum was constant now, a pressure in her skull. The crows were her relentless audience, their silent scrutiny driving her to the brink. She stopped sleeping, surviving on coffee and a frantic, digging energy. She was so close to the truth, she could taste it, a coppery, electric tang on her tongue. On the 10th night, the storm came. It broke over the Blackwood with biblical fury. Wind howled around the house like a banshee, and rain lashed the windows in solid sheets. Lightning flashed, illuminating the rooms in stark, actinic bursts, and thunder shook the very stones. It was during one of these brilliant, silent flashes that she saw him. A small boy, standing at the far end of the main hall. He was translucent, a photograph projected onto the air. He was wearing old-fashioned short trousers and a sweater, and he was holding the moth-eaten teddy bear. Thomas. The image vanished as the lightning faded, but the thunder that followed was different. It wasn't a crash from the sky. It was a deep, resonant boom that came from the basement. From the door. She ran, her flashlight beam jouncing wildly. The hum was no longer a hum, but a chord, a complex, dissonant piece of music that was both terrifying and beautiful. It was the song from Aethelred's journals. The air in the basement crackled with static. The black door was no longer inert. A faint, sickly green light pulsed from within the stone, tracing the orbits of the alien planets. The carvings seemed to be moving, shifting, the planets crawling across the surface. And the door was slightly ajar. A hairline crack of absolute blackness, from which the coppery smell poured out in a nauseating wave. This was it. The alignment Aethelred had written about. The storm, the house, the song, it was all coming together. She had to see. She had to know. She pushed. The door swung inward without a sound, moving on hinges that defied physics. It didn't open onto another room. It opened onto a tunnel, a rough, organic-looking passageway that sloped steeply downwards. The walls were not stone, but a veined, pulsating tissue, like the inside of a gigantic creature. The green light emanated from a bioluminescent fungus that clung to the walls, and the air was hot, humid, and thick with the smell of blood and ozone. The song was deafening here, a symphony of madness that vibrated in her bones. She descended, her mind screaming at her to turn back, but her historian soul, her desperate need to know, driving her forward. The tunnel opened into a cavern of impossible scale. This was not beneath the house. This could not be. The ceiling was lost in a gloom that swirled with those same phosphorescent colors from Aethelred's dreams. And before her stood the city. It was a vista of non-Euclidean nightmare. Towers of black stone twisted into shapes that hurt her eyes, leaning at angles that defied gravity. Staircases led nowhere, bridges looped back into themselves. And everywhere, carved into the architecture, were the same spirals and alien scripts from the house above. This was the source. The Aethelred House was just the tip of the iceberg, the earthly anchor for this pocket of blasphemous reality. And they were there. The listeners. They stood in the shadows of the impossible structures, tall, gaunt figures. They were humanoid but stretched, their limbs too long, their heads hairless and tilted back as if perpetually gazing at the swirling sky. They were motionless, silent, but she could feel their attention, a psychic weight that pressed down on her, threatening to crush her sanity. In the center of the city was a plaza, and in its center stood a stone altar. And on that altar, held down by tendrils of shadow, was the ghost of Thomas Aethelred. He was no longer translucent. Here, in this place, he was solid, real. He was struggling, his small form writhing against the bonds, his mouth open in a silent scream. Standing over him was another figure, also solid, also real. Alastair Aethelred. He looked exactly like his portraits, dressed in an old-fashioned suit, his face alight with a fervent, religious ecstasy. In his hands, he held a long obsidian knife. The bridge must be completed. Aethelred's voice echoed in her mind, not through her ears. The song is at its peak. Xylos aligns. His soul will anchor them here forever. He is the key. This was no ghost. This was a recording, a psychic echo of the original, blasphemous ritual, playing out on a loop for all eternity. Aethelred had sacrificed his own son to power this place, to open a permanent door for his listeners. Elara watched, frozen in horror, as the phantom Aethelred raised the knife. The listeners in the shadows began to shift, a dry, rustling sound that was the first physical noise she'd heard from them. They were turning, their featureless faces beginning to orient towards the altar. Towards her. The echo had become aware of her presence. The song swelled to an unbearable crescendo. The green light pulsed like a diseased heart. Thomas's silent scream was the most terrifying thing she had ever witnessed. Run. The thought was not her own. It was a single, desperate spark of survival instinct in a mind flooded with cosmic horror. She turned and fled back up the pulsating tunnel, the dissonant music clawing at her back. She didn't look back. She burst through the obsidian door, into the cold, familiar darkness of the basement. She didn't stop. She ran through the basement, up the stairs, through the halls of the house that was no longer just a house, but a mouth, a threshold. She didn't grab her gear, her research, her precious notes. They were tainted, part of the madness. She slammed the front door behind her and stumbled out into the storm. The rain was a blessing, washing the stench of that other place from her. The wind was a comfort, howling with the simple, natural fury of earth. She half ran, half fell down the overgrown path, branches whipping at her face, until she saw the grill of her Volvo. She fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking uncontrollably, finally jammed them into the ignition. The engine turned over with a sputter, then roared to life. She reversed wildly, spinning the wheel, not caring about the scratches from the trees, and sped down the broken track as if all the demons of hell were at her heels. She didn't stop driving until the sun was high in the sky, until the Blackwood was a dark smudge on the horizon behind her. She checked into a motel, the first one she found, and stood under the shower for an hour, scrubbing her skin raw, trying to wash away the memory of that pulsating tunnel, the sight of the altar, the sound of the song. Weeks passed. She gave a truncated, sanitized report to the university, claiming structural instability had forced her to abandon the project. They were disappointed, but accepted it. She tried to go back to her old life, to her books, her lectures on Georgian townhouses. But the world had lost its color, its substance. It felt like a thin veneer painted over a terrifying reality. She started seeing things. A flicker of a small boy in a crowded street. A murder of crows perched on the roof of her apartment building, watching her window. The smell of ozone and blood would sometimes waft past her on a sterile, air-conditioned breeze. She knew, with a cold, certain dread, that she hadn't escaped. Aethelred's house had needed a soul to anchor it. It had needed a bridge. Thomas's soul had been the sacrifice to open the door. But to keep it open, to maintain the connection, perhaps it needed a caretaker. A warden. Someone who had seen the truth and, in seeing it, had become a part of it. One evening, she was in her apartment, trying to read a mundane paper on Victorian guttering. A storm was brewing outside. As the first peal of thunder rolled across the city, she heard it. Faint, but unmistakable, vibrating up through the floorboards. A low sea. The hum. She looked up from her book, her blood turning to ice. Outside her window, perched on the fire escape, was a single, iridescent crow. It tilted its head, its bright eye fixed on her. And from the shadowy corner of her room, where the light from the lamp didn't quite reach, a small, translucent figure began to form. A boy in short trousers, holding a teddy bear. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking past her at the wall, his face a mask of terror. Elara knew what was happening. The house wasn't just a place. It was an idea. A cancer. And it was metastasizing. The alignment wasn't a one-time event. The door, once opened, could never be truly closed. It had followed her home. It had used her as a conduit. The hum grew louder, resolving into the first, familiar notes of the dissonant song. The air in her apartment grew cold, and the coppery scent of the Blackwood filled her lungs. She had gone to the Aethelred House as a historian, a collector of forgotten things. But the house and what lay behind it had collected her. She was part of its story now, a new character in its endless, screaming narrative. And as the green light began to pulse from her own living room wall, tracing patterns she now knew by heart, Elara realized the most horrifying truth of all. The listeners weren't just listening anymore. They were coming through.